to welcome everybody to today's Jewish Gen Talk with Sarina Roffé. We're so glad that you're with us. People are still logging in. We'll get started in a moment. You can let us know in the chat where you are logging in from, and we'll get started shortly. Someone, Chaya Friedman from Hawaii and Karen from Cancun. Very wonderful destinations where people are getting ready for Hanukkah. Barry Finkel in Chicago, David Sherson in Belmont, Massachusetts. We have Michael Cohn in New Jersey and Sarah Weil in Jerusalem. It's Hanukkah already there for you. Happy Hanukkah. Elona Avinezer, also in Jerusalem. And we have Adina in New York, Ala in Toronto. Yosef Yanin, also in Jerusalem. Susanna Levin in New Rochelle, New York. We are going to get started for today's talk. Today is a timely topic. We're going to talk about the Jews of Syria, specifically what happened to the Jews of Syria from 1936, and then later in the aftermath of the creation of the State of Israel, we'll talk through some of the persecutions, including the murder of the spy Eli Cohen, what relief was given to the Jewish organizations, who helped them, how they were able to leave in modern day in around the year 1992, what efforts were taken to help them. And Sarina is an expert on all of these matters, and we're so glad that she's joined us for 2 weeks in a row to give a webinar for Jewish Gen. And so, as always, she'll be available to take questions at the end. Please put your questions in the Q&A. This session is being recorded, and as always, we will send the recording to you first before we make it publicly available. And with that, I thank you all for joining us. And Sarina, I pass it over to you.
Hi, everybody. How are you? Christmas Day and Hanukkah starting tonight. So we see the light. I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the ancestry. The Jews of Syria had been there for centuries. They've been there under the Ottoman Empire, but even before the Ottoman Empire, they were in Syria. My grandparents came from Aleppo, but there were many Jews from Kamlishi and also from Damascus. When we think about the period, we have to understand that early immigration for these communities started in the early 20th century with the rise of Zionism and Theodor Herzl trying to establish a Jewish state. And then also the fact that the Ottoman Empire had gone bankrupt, the economy was terrible, that the opening of the Suez Canal had caused the caravan trade to end along the routes that went through Syria, through Aleppo and Damascus. So there was a lot of people emigrated in the early part of the 20th century, but many people stayed behind because they had property, they had significant holdings, they didn't think things were so terrible, they were able to stay. But during World War II, the French Vichy, remember this was a French mandate area. The French Vichy introduced anti-Semitic elements. There was a lot of newspaper articles, cartoons that basically planted the seeds for anti-Semitism as we know it today. And what happened was when the United Nations in 1947 voted to partition Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, there was a lot of anti-Jewish violence. It reached crisis proportions. Jews in Arab lands became the target of frustrated Arab mobs. Official discrimination, persecution, expulsion took place, leading Jewish communities really all over the Middle East to flee. There was a mass violation of human rights and of civil rights of Jews in Arab countries, all the Arab countries. And we know today that nearly 1 million, or about 900,000 Jews, had to leave Arab lands. We also know that, based on a recent report issued by Justice for Jews from Arab Lands, that in today's money, over 10 billion, and that's billion with a B like boy, in property and holdings were left in these Arab countries, in Syria alone. Sorry, in Syria alone. So on that fateful night, the Jews of Aleppo barricaded themselves into their homes when the Arabs rioted in the streets. They burnt synagogues, they burnt the schools, they burnt an orphanage. Over 100 stores were set ablaze. 75 Jews were murdered. And the once rich and secure family sat hovering, they would hover in the fear in the dark as rioters smashed through windows and destroyed pretty much everything in sight. After the riots, thousands of Jews left Syria, leaving behind their property and their belongings. The borders at that time were still semi-porous, making it kind of easy to get over the border into Israel or through Lebanon into Israel. But soon after, those borders shut tight, and they were not reopened again until 1992. After Israel was created, persecution of Jews remaining in Syria was common. They were no longer permitted to own property. They could not travel or practice their occupation. Jews who tried to leave the country were persecuted. Those who were permitted to travel for business reasons could not travel with family members. They would get travel papers like a laissez-passer, good for 3 months. They could not travel with their family members, and they had to leave behind a deposit, basically saying that they would come back. Business and educational opportunities were limited, and those who tried to escape and were caught were tortured and killed. Women were raped. The Syrian government feared that Jewish men would join forces with Israel and fight against them in the Israeli army. Among the many restrictions, Jews could not emigrate. They could not vacation abroad. They could not travel more than 3 kilometers from their home without permission. They could not drive a car. They could not even get a driver's license. They could not hold government jobs. They were watched constantly. People who left their homes were given to Palestinians, and Muslim administrators were placed in their schools. The Mukhabarat, or secret police, in their neighborhood followed their every movement. If they got a phone call, they had to report it, even though the Mukhabarat was listening on their phone. If they got a package from abroad, they had to go to the Mukhabarat and report it, even though the Mukhabarat probably opened that package before it ever got to them. Children were harassed by Muslim children on their way to and from school. From as early as 1947, after the pogroms, the Jews there asked for help emigrating. There's a letter dated August 5th, 1949, that was sent to New York to Rabbi Jacob Kasson, who was the chief rabbi of the community in Brooklyn, the Syrian community. It asked for help and a complete evacuation of all Jews from Syria. Another request was made to the Joint Distribution Committee in 1963, and it's noted in agency reports that we researched for a book that I'm currently in the process of writing. This was the environment in which Isaac Farhi was born in 1953. In 1961, when he was 7 years old, he and his brothers, I want to tell you a couple of stories, that's where this is going. He and his brothers were beaten by a gang of Arab boys. Say Muhammad in the messenger of God, and we'll all hurt you. The Arabs taunted them. It was common to be harassed going to and from school. When an Arab attacked a Jew, the police stood by, then also beat the Jews until they whispered the words. It was scary being a Jew. They were trapped. One day, Rabbi Yom Tov Yedid was accused of helping the Nachman family escape. The police needed to arrest someone because they needed to put fear in the community. His father, Isaac's father, Salim, was a lawyer and a liaison between the Aleppo community and the Mukhabarat. Salim sacrificed himself so the police would not arrest the rabbi and went to jail in his place. Isaac was a small boy at the time, and when they took his father to jail, they released Rabbi Yedid, but kicked him down the stairs. When Isaac's older brother, Dodi, told his mother about the arrest, fear spread. It was common knowledge that many people who went to jail never were heard from again, that the conditions were harsh and torture was common. Insults and beatings were common, and for a month, Salim was in jail and no visitors were permitted. In May 1965, we know that the Israeli spy Eli Cohen was hung in the town square in Damascus. Things got worse for the Jews, and Isaac was attacked again. He had his bar mitzvah, and on his walk home from synagogue, he was carrying his tefillin and his talet. An agency of the Mukhabarat stopped him and asked him what they were. Isaac didn't know how to explain it. The police thought that they were a way for him to connect with Israel. Isaac told them that it connected him to God by praying each morning. Isaac was 14 when the 1967 Six-Day War with Israel ended, and the young nation taking Israel and the Golan Heights. The Arabs took out their anger on the Jews of Syria. More and more Jews disappeared, including his sister Rosa. The Farhis feared for her safety, as a Muslim boy was attracted to her. His mother, Dorette, sold her precious gold bangles to pay the smugglers. People endangered their lives to cross the Bab al-Salam border into Turkey. When they left, there were no goodbyes because if the family had knowledge of the escape, they would be jailed. Others walked for hours in the mountains, crawling under fences where the smugglers felt it was safe. Single men disappeared in droves, leaving behind their families, and soon there were no boys left to marry. When they escaped, it had to be a moonless night, and they had to keep their children quiet to avoid attention. Children were sedated to make them sleep so as not to get caught. Understand that the smugglers were also taking merchandise, so the human cargo that they were taking along as they smuggled people across the border was part of the equation. When in Iskenderun, if they went through the mountains of Aleppo into Turkey, in Iskenderun, a Haran Shamish helped them get to Istanbul and to the Jewish agency where they were taken to Israel. When my grandfather, Joseph Nassim Misri, and 5 of his siblings were able to leave Syria in 1910, his sister Grace, married to Haim Dujati, remained behind as they had a thriving printing business, and they were quite wealthy. Over the years, various family members escaped. His granddaughter Ruth told me this story. My sisters Grace and Mimi escaped to Beirut in 1972 on New Year's Eve. It was a hot night to run away because the guards were busy getting drunk. They went with smugglers in a car and with fake IDs. They put their photo and an Arab name. They didn't even have to leave the car. It was easier to go that way. Then they went to the synagogue in Beirut, and they stayed with a family member and had to stay hidden. There were Syrian soldiers on the streets. Then they went by boat to Israel. Her brother Isaac went this way as well. When they ran away, the Mukhabarat came and almost broke the door down. They went to my father's store and arrested him. It happened twice, and each time you come home from jail, you're black and blue from the beatings and torture. Each time a child runs away, it's a few weeks in jail. They want to know who the smuggler is, and in the end, the smuggler that we used got killed. When I was 23, I decided to escape with my friend Esther Pardis. We met the smuggler at night and got on a bus. A few minutes later, the bus broke down. We got scared because we thought it was a trick to catch us, but it was legit. It was a Thursday night, January 24th, 1980. Since the bus broke down, we had to walk. We walked at night and hid in the daytime. We walked up and down the mountains, and it was cold and snowy. We walked for 3 days until Saturday night with nothing to eat in the cold. We walked through a river that was up to our necks in freezing water. The smugglers were carrying cocaine and drugs, and they said if we made noise and were caught, they would kill us. We were 30 people in total, and we had a few babies with us. They kept giving the babies Tylenol every 4 hours to keep them asleep so they wouldn't cry. Otherwise, the smugglers would kill them. When we got to the Turkish border, we had to lie down and sleep with snow on us. We had to hide until it got dark. Since the bus had broken down and it took longer than expected to get there, we lost the smuggler connection on the other side of the border. We waited. Maybe we had a little bread that we gave to the babies. The smugglers took us to a fence and cut it from the bottom in 2 places. 2 people had to hold it up, and we had to go one by one, crawling in the mud under the fence. Each time we had to wait for the border light to pass, then one person snuck under. So it took time for all of us to get through. Once on the other side of the border, we got a car service to take us to a Skender room. We went to an Arab hotel and we couldn't talk to anyone. We spoke Arabic, not Turkish, so if we spoke, they would know we were from Syria and might turn us in. We used the bathrooms, we undressed and let our clothing dry. It was now Monday, January 28th. At 6 a.m., Esther Shamish came. She took us to her son's house near the hotel. We went there and washed up, and they gave us food. We stayed there until night, and then they took us by bus to Istanbul. The snow was very high, and the bus couldn't handle the snow. It tumbled over and over. We got out of the bus through the window, and it was a miracle no one was hurt. She took us to another hotel, this one for people who were escaping. So understand that the Shamish family had an arrangement with the Jewish agency, the Shachnud, and they had a hotel that was rented and paid for by the Shachnud year-round only for people escaping from Syria. This was a dedicated hotel. Now, I'm telling you these stories so that you understand what people went through to leave Syria. I have many, many more stories of escape, but I think you get the picture. I have testimony of inhumane torture. It was a nightmare living in Syria from 1947 to 1992, but there are many people who helped them. Millions of dollars were sent into Syria by the Near East Jewish Aid Society, the Joint Distribution Committee. There are reports that every Jewish agency in the world knew about it, that there were protests, that there were letter writing campaigns, that there were conferences, but nobody could really do anything because they were powerless in the face of a government. Agency archives are rich with this information. There's a very famous photo, which I'm going to show you now, on the cover of the New York Times, April 29th, 1974. Showing a protest of solidarity for the Soviet Jews. On the back of the photo, you'll see a banner that says Free Syrian Jews. This was the work of a Syrian Jew named Abe Dweck. He had been born in Syria, and he was like this one-man band that headed a committee for the rescue of Syrian Jews. And he was at every demonstration, every rally with this sign. I'm going to share this one slide with you so that you could see, and you can tell me if I did this correctly. If you see it, do you see the slide or no?
You could make it a little bit bigger if you go to full screen mode.
Okay. Slide. You see it?
Yeah.
Full screen?
I mean, you still see, yeah, adjust the display settings like last time.
Swap. Okay.
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, so understand that during the 70s, everybody was worried about the refuseniks. And the idea of the Syrian Jews was low on the totem pole. because the Soviet Jewry was taking up all the headlines. And this went on and on. So nobody was paying attention to Syrian Jewry. But this is a protest and a march for Soviet Jews. But in this background, you see this, I don't know if you can see my arrow, but you see it says Free Syrian Jewry. Okay. Now I want to also show you this next slide, which is kind of the path of Syrian Jews and what they had to go through. So if you were from Aleppo or you were from Qamishli, now Qamishli was a smaller town further north, up close to the border with Turkey. And during the French Mandate period, the French tried to entice people to go to this particular town to do farming and agriculture. So there aren't that many Jews living here, but there were enough. I mean, I want to say 1,000, 1,200. And so they were up in this part of the country. Aleppo is here. And you could see that it's not very far from Iskenderun. It's like 150 miles. It's not terribly difficult. And when they say take taxis, the taxis were sharuts, similar to what you see in Israel. Okay. And then this next slide, sorry, I think I went too fast. Okay. I want to show you this one. So this slide shows you how mountainous it was, okay? So now if you're coming from Damascus, and that's down here, you want to go into Lebanon, because it's a lot easier for you to go into Lebanon than it is to go into Damascus. And then it is to go all the way up through the mountains into Aleppo. Now, you did have people from Aleppo who managed to take a bus down to further south through Homs, and then they'd take different routes and get down to Damascus, and then they'd go into Lebanon as well. But you didn't have Jews from Damascus going the Turkish route. Okay, the Turkish route was specifically restricted for the Jews because it was really a harder route. If you're going from Damascus, you could, it was very common for people to go into a library. If you went to a library or a gym, you had to leave your ID card kind of like in a box on the counter. So sometimes what they would do is the Syrian Jew might take the ID card of an Arab, which by the way even though it was stamped Musawi, which means Jew, it was a different size than a Muslim ID card. So if you stole a Muslim ID card, they had people who would help you replace the photo, and then you would take the Arab name of that person. And crossing the border into Lebanon was not that difficult because you only had to show an ID card. You didn't have to show a passport or anything like that. Now, the other issue with going through Turkey, I'll go back to that other slide, with going through Turkey is that when you went through Turkey, to get out of Turkey into Israel, although the Israelis could give you a temporary travel papers to get into Israel, you still needed an exit visa. So this guy, Shamosh, had an arrangement with the government where he would buy entry visas, because remember, they were entering illegally. So he'd buy an entry visa for like 70 lira. This happened through till the 80s. And then in the 80s, he switched his operation to Antakya, which is where his wife's family was from. Okay. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for a second. And then, hold on, stop share. Okay. Okay. So, oh, okay. So, actually start sharing again, because I realized the next thing I want to show you is actually in this. Okay. All right. Am I? Sure. Okay. So I want to show you this picture. Okay. So
Sarina,
in
go back to
Beirut,
adjust your screen
switch it again.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you for telling me.
Sure.
The
display settings on top.
Oh, right. Display settings. Okay. Stop. Okay. Okay, so in Beirut, from about the end of, I want to say about 1949 until 1961, there was a woman there. She'd actually been born in Argentina, and then her family moved to Jerusalem where they lived. And when she was in high school, her parents arranged for a marriage for her for someone from Beirut, a rich, wealthy Jew from Beirut. And in 1948, the borders closed, and then she didn't have any access to her family. But her husband was rather wealthy, and she would go to parties and things like that. And she overheard information that she knew would be helpful to the government of Israel. So she wrote this letter, and she managed to get it smuggled over the border into Israel to a kibbutz. This was very early on, like 1949. And right away, the Mossad saw her value, and they arranged for her to be smuggled over the border. They met with her, and she actually did about 25 missions for Mossad. But more importantly, she became the person who helped the people that were going into the Jewish community of Beirut to get smuggled into Israel. Now, understand that the Jewish community of Beirut is really a new community. They only started in the early 20th century. They're not an old Jewish community, and most of the people were transplants from Syria anyway. And what happened was the Jews escaping from Syria would go to the Jewish community, and the community didn't know what to do with them. And so Shula took up this banner, and she made arrangements for them to go south through Hezbollah territory, the southern part of Lebanon. The last 5 miles before you reach the border with Israel is Hezbollah territory. And to get through Hezbollah territory into Israel. And she had, a bunch of smugglers that helped her with that. But after a while, things got hot, and so many people were coming, and the community was mad because they had to hide these people until it was safe to get them out. And they would hide them in warehouses, in the synagogue, in different places. Isaac Farhi was hidden for 9 months until they could get him out. And he lived in someone's house. So it became an operation, and they had to feed them, and these people couldn't go out on the streets because the Mukhabarat was on the streets looking for them, so they had to stay hidden. They couldn't work. The community had to provide them with food, with clothing, with shelter. So eventually they changed routes. So one of the routes was that you would go by rowboat into the Mediterranean Sea, and the Israeli Navy would pick them up by submarine once you got 3 miles out. My cousin Isaac said that this was the route that he took. They went 4 people in a rowboat out into the Mediterranean. But then some people drowned, that also became dangerous. Then later they started meeting the ferry that went from Beirut to Cyprus, and they would stop the ferry and pick people up off of the ferry. So understand now, if we're going back through Turkey, and I'm sorry I keep switching back and forth, but she did missions through 1961. She was arrested by the Lebanese government for espionage, not for the Syrians, for the smuggling of Syrians, but for espionage. She was sentenced to life, and she was supposed to get death, but after the 1967 war, she was traded in a prisoner exchange to Israel. From 1961 till 1971, you had Albert Aliyah, who was the secretary of the Jewish community of Beirut. So he would make similar arrangements. And then in 1971, he got kidnapped off the streets of Beirut by the Mukhabarat. Back to Turkey, the Shamish family had worked with Mossad and also helped thousands of Jews get across the border to safety and then to Israel. So Iskenderun is along the Mediterranean coast. And I said to him once, I interviewed him several times, why didn't they just go by boat rather than by bus from Iskenderun to Istanbul, because it's 21 hours by bus and they had to be escorted. And he said that the boat only came every 2 weeks and they had a lot of people they were processing. So the way it started with the Shemoshes is that his father had been sent there in 1932 as the rabbi of the community from Aleppo to serve the community of Iskenderun. And uh, people showed up at his door. And so he started, and then again, the Jewish agency came, they arranged for the hotel in Istanbul, and they basically set up the process by which these people were escaping. So people started to show up at their doors in 1951. They snuck over the border into Turkey, came to his house with no money, filthy, dirty from traversing through the mountains. I'm going to just stop sharing now, because and the first family was 12 people, and he got them to Istanbul, and he didn't know what to do even when he got to Istanbul. So he went first to the Jewish community, then he went to the consulate, then this whole arrangement was set up with the Jewish agency. They actually went to Iskenderun to see and help him with his operations, and they paid the expenses. The Shemosh family themselves didn't profit from it. They just were helping the refugees come across the border. He worked with trusted smugglers who got Aleppan Jews there. They often used a code word, or they would have half of a photo and half of an earring or something like that, and the smuggler would have the other half. And that was the way they knew somebody was trusted. Some people had funds to pay on their own, others had to be helped with money. The process was that the smugglers told the refugees only to wear the clothes on their back, because they were often smuggling drugs as well. They couldn't carry any documents or photos with them. Usually they were smuggled at the border at midnight when it was dark and the guards were relaxed. They arrived hungry and they had to be fed. The Shamishes got the refugees new clothing and shelter until arrangements could be made for them to get to Istanbul. They often used a hotel called the Gold Palace Hotel to put the groups waiting for transportation from Israel. I have to mention Judy Feldkar. She lived in Toronto. She had heard about and had worked actually with Rabbi Mitchell Searles to set up communication with Damascus, with Rabbi Hamra. She helped over the years over 3,200 people escape. Some of them she paid ransoms, some of them she helped with paying bakshish, because everything in the Middle East is about bakshish, bribes. I think there's a bit of an overlap between her and the Shemosh family, because some of the families she helped get out went to Shemosh, so the numbers, don't quite add up because there's a bit of overlap between the two. But gradually their network, her network grew, and she sent money, she sent supplies, religious materials. You see, even if you had permission to leave, you had to pay bakshish so your paper could get stamped. So Judy paid money for the ransoms. Sometimes it was somebody needed a roof or holiday clothes for their children. There were a lot of very intricate schemes to get people out of Syria. She never approached anyone. The families came to her. They found her through word of mouth. She basically was getting people out from 1977 until 2001. She was very careful. She literally bought their lives. She had rules. Each person could only go with two sets of clothing on them. It had to be a moonless night. 2 sets of clothing, no valuables, no jewelry, no personal items. And those who doubt the credibility of her work need only see the mountains of files which I saw, which documented each person she rescued or helped or ransomed. There's a Sephardic tradition that you name your children for your parents to honor them. Many of those who were helped by Judy named their children after her. So during a time when the world was focused on the issue of Soviet Jews, little attention was paid to the plight of Syrian Jews. Dr. Meyer Ballas came to the United States in 1978. It took him 2 years to get permission, and he did it with the help of Congressman Stephen Solars and community member Stephen Shallum. He got away from severe oppression, and he helped because he wanted to get into a special medical program. When he arrived in New York, he started again raising awareness about what was happening with the Syrian Jews at synagogues, any place anyone would listen to him. In 1989, he became president of something called the Council for the Rescue of Syrian Jews. It took 10 years of his life and a dedicated team, but he personally met with President George Bush to put the issue of Jews from Arab lands on the table. In 1989, the council saw the political situation for the Jews of Syria that the doors might open because the Soviet Union had fallen apart. Syria needed money and they had lost the support of Russia. So that Syria approached the US. Well, the council did heavy lobbying. And they basically said any conversation with Syria has to include what are you doing about the Syrian Jews? So after heavy political pressure and because he needed money, in April 1992, Assad went to the Jewish community of Damascus and basically told them that they could leave. So hence Passover, April 1992, and Exodus. So beginning then, there was a major exodus, and there were 4,500 people left between 1992 and 1994. They all came to Brooklyn, New York. Now, understand, Assad would not allow them to go to Israel. They could only come to New York, to the United States. They had to have round-trip airline tickets. The resettlement was handled by Bikur Halim, Sephardic Bikur Halim, assisted by Nayana that did English language lessons, Hayes that managed things like all of their paperwork for visas and stuff like that. There were other organizations that helped, like the Joint Distribution Committee, B'nai B'rith, the Jewish Agency, UJA Federation provided I think something like $26 million for resettlement. The airline tickets, if people couldn't pay their own airline tickets out of Syria, $3 million was given by Edmund Safra. That money, when people arrived, they would take the airline ticket, get a refund so that they could use it for another family for the other half of the ticket. Settlement was hard. Because understand, Nayana was giving English lessons to Russian Jews, and this was who basically might identify as Jewish but had no religious education, whereas the Syrian Jews were coming out were very religious. They had to live near a synagogue. Their kids had to go to yeshiva, and the synagogues were full in the community. How do you find homes for that many people? And you're talking about not just apartments, but you're talking about furniture, kitchen supplies, bedding, jobs, and then 900 children had to be placed in yeshiva. So this was a major settlement effort to get all of this done, and Sephardic Bikur Halim was the head or the hub for all of this. Ballas made a Herculean effort to get the 900 children into yeshiva. He would find 2 seats here and 2 seats there and 2 seats in this room. The synagogues couldn't accommodate them. That holiday, they had tents, in people's backyards to accommodate people for the holidays because the synagogues weren't big enough to accommodate that many new people. So the last person in my family to leave Aleppo was my grandfather's sister's grandson. His name was Edmund Jujati. He came in April 1992. So it took my family 8 decades to leave Syria. And with that, I will stop and ask questions. Avrami?
Sarina, do you want to look? It looks like there's just one question in the Q&A.
Oh.
I'll just remind everybody that if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A, not in the chat.
Oh,
We'll try to
okay.
get
I'm
to
looking in the chat. Okay, the Q&A. Oh, okay. Who and when was the codex from the Great Synagogue smuggled out to Israel? So the codex was considered a talisman for the community in Aleppo, and it was smuggled out well after this in the 1950s into Turkey. It surfaces in Israel, I believe, in 1957, but I'd have to look it up. Something like that. Okay.
Anybody else have any questions?
What was the language spoken? Arabic. Language spoken was Arabic. What kind of people were the smugglers? Any affinity for Jews or just business? I would say they were Muslim smugglers and it was just business for them. They made a lot of money off of smuggling. How long had your family lived in Syria? My family lived in Syria predates 1492. As long as I know, my own family was in Syria. Okay. Are there any Jews left? I understand that there's 4 known Jews left in Syria. I don't think anybody's going back. They might visit if it became safe, but I don't think they're going back to live. Did Jews move from Aleppo to Damascus and vice versa? My grandfather's from Damascus, but I have DNA cousins from Aleppo. Same last name, Nasser. Yes, I believe people did move back and forth, although I will tell you when they came to the United States in the early 20th century, these were 2 communities that were not in connection with each other that much. For example, in my community, if you were from Aleppo, you didn't marry someone whose family was from Damascus. They were like, it was like unheard of. And then later it became more accepted, and then later we started to accept that you could marry an Ashkenazi Jew. I mean, I'm joking here, but it was literally like that. It was like you were marrying out if you married someone from Damascus and your family was from Aleppo. But I do know that Rabbi Yedid's daughter married someone from Damascus. He was the chief rabbi in Aleppo, and his daughter married Victor Fariwa, who was a doctor in Damascus. So I do know that people did go back and forth. I would love to hear a condensed story of Jews in Syria. Was there a time that Jews and Muslims lived harmoniously? When was that? So there's another presentation I do if Rami wants about the history of the Jews in Syria. Happy to do that another time, but it's a little much for this presentation. Jews did live harmoniously, but when I say harmoniously, it means that the Jews in Syria, and really in all Muslim countries, I don't want to just say Syria, they knew how to keep their heads down, because you have to understand that under the Quran, Jews were dhimmi, which meant that you were protected people. And that meant that you could practice your religion, you lived as an autonomous community, you paid a jizya or a special poll tax to the government for the right to not serve in the military, etc. So as long as you understood those rules, you were okay. Did that mean that occasionally there were economics or situations where a frustrated Arab might take their temper out on you? Of course not. They did, and when it tended to be that when the economy was bad, Jews got treated worse. A lot of people feel like felt like, under Germany, the star that you used to wear on your shirt or on your jacket was a German invention. It actually wasn't. It was a Muslim invention dating from the 8th century and the Pact of Umar, which set out all of the rules for Jews. Like you couldn't ride a horse because then your head would be higher than a Muslim. You had to ride a goat. You couldn't build new synagogues, things like that. You weren't allowed to do without permission, because they didn't want, for example, a synagogue to be higher than a mosque. All of those kinds of things were rules. But if you knew your place in society, if you were apolitical, you didn't have a problem. How have most of the Syrian community remained in the US, or did a percentage go to Israel? So there are Syrian Jewish communities all over Latin America, and definitely in Israel, there are a number of Syrian Jewish communities. Where was your family from before 1492? No clue. New York Syrian community has a reputation of being very closed. Is that true, and why? I don't know about the word closed. The community wants to keep its traditions and its heritage alive. They are very interested in keeping their traditions and their heritage alive, and they felt very, very threatened by the fact that a lot of Ashkenazic communities have a very high rate of intermarriage, that families often move away from each other. For example, you send your kid away to college in California, he stays in California. They want to keep people close. And as an example, every Friday night, I sit down to dinner with my children and my grandchildren, all of them. Okay. And that's the way it is in this community, is that we want to keep our children and our grandchildren close to us. When you spread out and you lose the connection, you lose your heritage. There are other outside influences. The Aleppo Codex also is something that we feel very close to because we feel it protects us. Only Arabic. How are they integrated into Israel's society? Were they all religious? Yes, they were all religious. Yes, only Arabic. They had to go to and take lessons to learn Hebrew and speak Hebrew. Okay, let's see. I may have missed this, but when did the Jews first come to Syria? Jews have been in Syria since, I don't know, thousands of years. The Great Synagogue of Aleppo is supposedly from the time of King David. My mother's cousin in Damascus was imprisoned because of fear that he would join the Israeli army during the War of Independence. Okay, so that confirms a lot of what I said. Was there intermarriage between Jews and Syrians? If you're talking about in Syria itself, very little. When they got to the United States, New York specifically, between 1933 and 1934, there were 15 intermarriages with non-Jews or converts. That caused the Jewish community in Brooklyn the rabbi to issue an edict against intermarriage and against marriage to converts, because he believed that if you converted for the purpose of marriage, then it could not be sincere, or most probably was not sincere. There's like a small percentage it might be sincere, and that's another presentation. Is there a good way for me to connect with Meyer Ballas? It's the name of Ballas is the name of my great-grandmother. Yes, if you contact me after, I'm happy to connect you. They were considered second-class citizens. They weren't even citizens. You weren't a citizen. You were a guest in the country, or you could say you had second class because you were not equal to Muslim. If you went to a court and you had a case against a Muslim, the word of the Muslim was always taken over the word of a Jew or a Christian. You were not equal. You were not the same. A Muslim was the only full citizen. Okay. My close friend from the something Harari family was smuggled through Lebanon and into Israel in the 1940s. Okay. These are the kinds of stories I'm collecting. If you want to connect me with him, I'm happy to take his story for my book. What is the best place to find Jewish Syrian genealogy in addition to JewishGen? Really, JewishGen is the place. I mean, everything that we've done through Sephardic Heritage Project is on JewishGen. There is a Mediterranean project on the IGRA website, Israel Genealogical Research Association. They may have some data that wasn't put on JewishGen. Since your family arrived in Syria before 14, did your family consider themselves Sephardi or Mizrahi? You know, I've never really asked that question. We always considered ourselves Sephardic, although understand that I actually did a paper that you can search. Sepharad, according to the Torah, is a place north of Eretz Israel, which is Syria. And Jews from Syria had gone to the Iberian Peninsula with the Muslims, and then came back after 1492. So I always consider myself Sephardi, although some people designate us as Mizrahi. I'm not sure that there's really much of a difference. I used to know that in Deal, New Jersey, there's a large Syrian community. Yes. Understand the Deal community is kind of an offshoot of Brooklyn, and there's a deep connection between the two. Do your children and grandchildren speak Arabic? No. The new Syrians that came in 92 and those who escaped, they speak Arabic. My grandparents were born in Syria and were Arabic speaking. My parents both spoke Arabic as their first language and spoke Arabic to each other, but not to us. They wanted us to learn English. And so me and my siblings never learned it. You should try and find out where your family came from in 1492. Okay. Do children and grandchildren not go to schools out of town out of New York? Well, in elementary school, they're going, and high school, they're going to local yeshivas. As far as out of town, yes, I would say now people are sending their kids away to college, but they hold them pretty tight. David M. Cohen, my mother and father came to Macon, Georgia in 1908 and 1911 from Aleppo. When will it be safe to travel there to trace my heritage? Good question. No idea. I don't know that you can trace your heritage there. I think that most of the documents are in the Israeli National Archives, and a lot of them have been translated and uploaded onto IGRA's website, so you can search there. We have some great databases on JewishGen. We have the Brit Milah database. We have a marriage database. We have a cemetery database, and more is coming down the road. Were they wealthy there? And if so, how did they amass their wealth? Some people were wealthy, and just like every other community, you have this bell curve of who's wealthy and who's not wealthy. And they amassed, some of them did import export, some of them had retail, some of them were craftspeople, different people in different ways. They were customs before the Ottoman Empire crashed, some of them were customs agents. With so much intermarriage, did that generate genetic medical problems? I think some. Usually there were a lot of first cousin marriages, but that occurred throughout the world, not just in Jewish circles, in Ashkenazic circles as well. If you go back in time, maybe 3 or 4 generations, you'll see first cousin marriages all over. My husband's family, they were among his grandmother's family, there were 84 first cousins, and 16 of those were first cousin marriages. So, you know, you have to, you know, that was just very commonplace. Is the Bet Din there was only Jewish law? Well, a Bet Din is Jewish by definition. My grandmother, born in Aleppo, spoke Arabic and French. Yes, a lot of them spoke French. Syria was a Francophone country. The Alliance was there, so kids who went to school with the Alliance would have learned French. How were the Jews treated during World War II? I think I answered that at the beginning, because the Germans were on the street and had introduced a lot of anti-Semitic There was a lot of anti-Semitic stuff going on, especially in the newspapers. Emily says, I have a researcher I can introduce to the man from Macon. Text me. Okay. And then Karen says, just an FYI, my Hamisha relatives escaped through Lebanon via boat, which hit a rock. Then they had to throw everything overboard to make it to Israel. My Harari and Benbaji relatives escaped via land. One of the children was a donkey. The journey was too rough for my great-grandfather, who insisted on walking, and he passed away before arriving in Israel. I actually know this story. Someone told it to me. Richard says, did they take their disagreements only to the Bet Din and not to Muslim courts there? You couldn't take internal, with Jew to Jew, you'd go to a Bet Din, but Jew to Muslim, you had to go to Muslim courts. And that is the rest of the questions, unless I missed something. Oh, there's things in the chat as well. Let me just see if I missed something. That's it. Okay. I thank you all for staying with me. This has been
Serina,
amazing.
yeah, this
A lot of great questions.
is very nice. This is a nice, we should just do an open Q&A with you for one webinar and just with questions. Thank you, Serina. Thank you for being with us today. And I thank everybody for joining us. I'm putting in the chat a link to our Hanukkah companion. You should always receive this via email, but I'm putting it here so you'll get this a couple hours ahead of most people. You could click the link and then you could download it. It's a collection of excerpts from our Yizkor book translations, and it talks about how Hanukkah was celebrated and observed in different communities during different time periods. And Sarina, we don't really have a lot for Sephardic experiences that talk about Sephardic way of life during Hanukkah, and maybe that's something that we could work on for the future. We've focused a lot on records, but we haven't focused so much on testimony about how people lived.
Oh, okay.
Love to be able to do something like that for the Sephardic community in the future. So everybody, the link is in the chat. Thank you all for joining us. I wish you all a very happy Hanukkah. And Sarina, I will already accept your offer to give another presentation. So we will work on that one. And wishing everybody all the best. Happy Hanukkah.
Okay, happy Hanukkah.